A bride was sent to a man long dead. His best friend married her same afternoon. The preacher was still holding his hat when I told him we wouldn't be needing a second service. He looked at me like I'd grown a second head. I didn't blame him. I'd looked at myself the same way about 10 minutes earlier, standing outside the depot with Cora Fenn's traveling trunk at my feet and the telegram from Abilene still folded in my breast pocket. The one that said Dallin Reese had been dead 6 weeks, thrown from a horse on a night drive outside of Dodge. Neck broke before he hit the ground. Dallin had been my friend for 22 years. We trailed cattle together before we each put down roots. He'd filed his homestead north of mine, close enough that we could see each other's smoke on a cold morning. He'd written to me in the fall and said he was sending for a woman. Said her name was Cora, that she was from Ohio, a widow herself, and that he'd corresponded with her for near 8 months and she was coming out in the spring. I'd written back and said, "Good for you, Dallin." That was November. He died in February. Nobody told the woman in Ohio. I don't know how it happened. I didn't know it had happened until she was already standing on the platform at Ellsworth in a green wool dress with a trunk behind her and a carpetbag in her hand, looking for a man she'd never met in person, a man whose letters she'd been keeping in a bundle tied with twine that I would see for the first time 3 weeks later, when she undid it at the kitchen table, and smoothed each one out flat on the wood like she was reading a map of somewhere she'd already traveled and couldn't get back to. She was not what I expected. I don't know what I expected. Dallin had written that she was good-looking, and I'd taken that as a man saying what a man says about a woman he's sweet on. He was not wrong, exactly, but it wasn't the kind of looks that hit you like a fist. It was more like if you'd spent a long winter inside and then walked out into the first real March morning when the air still had cold in it, but the light was different. You'd know what I mean. Something in her face was clear like that. Something in the way she stood, with her weight settled even and her eyes going around the platform taking inventory, was not fragile. She found me because I was the only man standing near the trunk. She said, "Mr. Reese." I said, "No, ma'am, Harlan Cade. I was his neighbor. There's something I need to tell you." She went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He's dead, isn't he?" It wasn't a question. Something in my face had told her, or maybe she'd known longer than the platform, some part of her, the part that keeps count of things that don't add up. Dallin had written her every 2 weeks without fail for 8 months, and then the letters had stopped coming. I learned that later. She'd written twice and got no answer and told herself the mail was unreliable on the frontier and bought her ticket anyway, because a woman in Ohio with nothing to stay for doesn't have the luxury of bad omens. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together and nodded once and looked at the trunk. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "What do I do now?" Again, not exactly a question. More like something she was saying to the air, figuring, the way you do when you've come to a place on a trail where the marked fork is gone and you have to work out direction from the sun. I looked at her. I looked at the trunk. I thought about what was waiting back at my place, a ranch house that ran all right but ran on function, not on any kind of life, with 2 hired hands and a cook who came in Tuesdays and Fridays, and a silence in the evenings that I had learned to treat like weather, something that came in and you waited for it to pass. I thought about what Dallin would have said. He'd have said, "Harlan, don't be a fool, take care of her." He'd have laughed when he said it because that was how Dallin was about everything, even things that mattered. I said, "Ma'am, I know this is not a thing a stranger ordinarily says, but I'm going to ask you something and I want you to hear it straight." She looked at me. She had gray eyes. I noticed that, gray and level. I said, "I've got a working ranch 12 miles north of here that needs a woman who knows how to run a house, and I've got a name in this county that means something. I'm not Dallin. I know I'm not what you came for. But if you're willing, I'd be honored to marry you this afternoon and take you home. You'd have your own room until you decide otherwise. You'd have the protection of my name and the work of the place if you want it, and solitude if you don't. I'm not making you a promise of love. I'm making you a promise of respect and a roof, and a man who keeps his word." She looked at me for what felt like a long time. Wind came through the platform and moved a piece of hair against her cheek, and she didn't push it away. She said, "How long did you know him?" I said, 22 years. She said, "Was he a good man?" I said, "He was the best one I knew, until I was standing in front of you." I don't know where that came from. It wasn't a line. I hadn't prepared a single word of what I'd said. I felt the back of my neck go hot when it was out, and I almost took it back, almost said I didn't mean it the way it sounded, but she made a small sound through her nose that might have been the beginning of a laugh, and she picked up her carpetbag. She said, "All right, Mr. Cade. Let's find the preacher." We were married at 3:30 in the afternoon in the back room of the Methodist Church on Dunbar Street. The preacher, whose name was Hollies, had a cold and kept his hat on the whole time. There were no witnesses except a woman who ran the millinery next door named Dorothea, who Hollies pressed into service, and who kept looking at Cora with an expression I couldn't read, something between alarm and admiration. Cora said the words when they came to her. Her voice was steady. Mine was steady too, mostly. Hollies said, "You may kiss your bride," and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I took her hand and bent and touched my lips to the back of it, which was not what he meant, but it was what was right. She squeezed my fingers once when I did it barely, but I felt it. We drove back to the ranch in the wagon, 12 miles of April grassland, the sky enormous and going copper at the edges. She sat beside me on the bench with her hands in her lap and her trunk behind us, and she asked me questions the whole way, practical ones about the ranch and the hands and what the winters ran like, and what the nearest town was, and whether there was a doctor inside 40 miles. I answered them straight. She listened like she was filing it away, all of it, going through a ledger in her head and entering each number in its column. About 8 miles, and she said, "I kept his letters." I said, "I know." She said, "Is that strange, that I still have them?" I said, "No." She said, "He wrote well. He was funny, I liked his letters." I said, "He was funny. He was also stubborn as a creek stone and wrong about cattle half the time, but he was the kind of man you wanted around when things went hard." She said, "Were things hard?" I said, "Off and on. They always are out here, but we got through them." She nodded and looked out at the grass and the last light on it. She said, "I'm sorry you lost him." I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd been thinking about her loss, about the strangeness of her situation, about what I'd taken on and whether I'd done right. I hadn't sat with my own grief yet, which I suppose is what happens when there's work in front of you. But she said it, and something shifted in my chest, some knot of a thing I'd been carrying since the telegram, and I tightened my hands on the reins and didn't say anything for a minute. Then I said, "Thank you." That was all either of us said until we turned up the last road, and she saw the ranch house for the first time in the last of the light, the long roof and the dark cottonwoods, and the lamp already burning in the window because Enrique had seen us coming. She said, "It's a good place." I said, "It is." She said, "He would have been happy here." I said, "I believe he would." The first weeks were not easy and they were not hard. They were something else, careful, like two people learning the weight of a new tool where the balance point is how much force it takes. She moved through the house like she'd been doing inventory since we pulled into the yard, which I suppose she had been. She found things wrong that I'd stopped seeing. The north window in the kitchen had a broken latch, and I'd been propping it with a stick for 2 winters. She replaced the latch on the 3rd day. I came in at noon, and the stick was gone, and the window sat level, and she didn't mention it. She just moved on to the next thing. She was in the kitchen before I was up in the mornings. By the time I came in, there was coffee and something on the stove, and she'd already had her own cup, and was sitting at the table reading or mending or going through the ledger I kept for the cattle. I found that on the 4th morning, her sitting there with the ledger open and a pencil in her hand, and I stopped in the doorway. She looked up and said, "You're undercharging Tillman for the board on his horses." I said, "I know, he's a neighbor." She said, "He's a neighbor who can afford to pay." I said, "That's fair." She said, "I'm not saying raise it to market. I'm saying raise it to reasonable." I said, "All right." She went back to the ledger. I poured my coffee. That was how it went. She didn't ask permission for things, and she didn't offer opinions on things that weren't her business, and she seemed to know the difference with a precision that I'd never encountered in anyone, man or woman. She ran the house like it was something she'd been doing for years, which in Ohio I suppose it had been. She'd been married before. A man named Fenn who died of a fever, no children, 4 years of that marriage, and then 4 years of nothing before she'd started corresponding with Dahlan. I knew all of this because she told me. A piece at a time, the way you peel bark, not performed, not confessional, just offered when it was relevant, when the conversation came close enough to touch it. She told me about Fenn on the 2nd week when she was tending a cut on my hand I'd gotten running wire. She worked without looking at my face, and she said, "My first husband was afraid of blood, couldn't look at it. I had to look away from him while I dressed my own wounds so he wouldn't get sick. She tied off the bandage with a small, neat knot. She said, "You're not like that." I said, "No." She said, "Good." She let go of my hand, and I held onto the warmth of where her fingers had been for longer than made sense. The trouble came in the 5th week. It was always going to come from somewhere. That's the country, it's never just the land and the cattle, there's always something else, men being what they are. A man named Cord Purcell ran a spread 20 miles southeast, and he'd been wanting to buy my north pasture for 3 years. I'd said no 3 times, and the 3rd time I'd said it in a way he didn't forget. When word got around town that I'd married, he started saying things. I don't know exactly what things because I didn't hear them directly. I heard about them secondhand from Enrique, who heard them at the feed store, which is where men in small counties hear everything they shouldn't. What Purcell was saying was that I'd married a woman who'd come out for a dead man, and that there was something shameful in that. For her, for me, for the whole arrangement. He said it in the joking way men say things when they want the meanness to land without the accountability. I went to town to deal with it. That's all I'll say about that part. I dealt with it the way you deal with something that's putting rot in a fence post. You dig it out before it spreads. What I didn't know was that Cora had heard about it before I did. I came back from town in the late afternoon, and she was on the porch when I rode in. She watched me come up the road and down from the horse, and she didn't say anything until I was on the steps. Then she said, "Did you hit him?" I said, "No." She said, "Did you want to?" I said, "Yes." She nodded. She said, "Enrique told me what he was saying." I said, "I should have dealt with it sooner." She said, "What did you say to him?" I told her, not the exact words, which were plain and short, but the meaning of them, that I'd married her lawfully and respectably, and that she bore my name now, and any man who spoke about her in the way Purcell had been speaking could take that up with me personally. That I wasn't in a temper when I said it, which is the part that tends to stick. She was quiet a moment. She said, "Were you in a temper?" I said, "A little." She said, "Good." I laughed. I hadn't laughed, a real one, since before the telegram, and it surprised me enough that I looked away. She was looking at me when I looked back. Something in her face was not soft. She didn't go soft, but it had shifted. Open, maybe, like the difference between a door standing shut and a door standing shut but unlatched. She said, "Nobody stood up for me like that, not in a long time." I said, "It won't be the last time." I don't know why I said it as a promise. It came out that way. She said, "I know," and she went inside. I want to tell you about the night in June. There was a storm that came in from the northwest, the kind that doesn't announce itself properly, a pale line on the horizon and then nothing, and then all at once the sky goes wrong. I've been watching it come since supper. By 9 o'clock the wind was up hard and the horses were unhappy in the barn, and there were cattle out in the north pasture that needed moving, or we'd lose them to the gulch if the runoff came down the way I thought it would. I got up in the dark and pulled on my boots and coat and went out. The rain had started by then, not heavy yet but mean, that slanted kind that comes in sideways and finds every gap in your collar. I had Enrique up already, and we went out on horseback into what turned into about 3 hours of that. The dark and the rain and the cattle and the gulch running fast and brown below us. We got them moved. All but 3, which I spent the last hour of it finding and driving up from the draw on my own in the dark. And by the time I came back to the barn, I was soaked through and cold in the bones the way you don't warm up fast from, the kind of cold that sits down deep. I pulled my horse in and got him seen to and stood in the barn doorway looking at the house and the lamp burning in the kitchen window. And I thought, she's still up. And I thought she shouldn't be, it's past midnight. And then I thought she knew I was out in it. I went inside. She was at the kitchen table with coffee on the stove. She looked at me, took me in once, top to bottom, and she stood up without a word and went to the stove and poured 2 cups and set one at the table and one on the windowsill close to the lamp where the warmth collected, and she said, "Sit over there. You're blue." I sat by the lamp. She sat across the table and pulled her shawl around her and she said, "Did you lose any?" I said no. She said, "Good." I held the cup in both hands. Neither of us talked for a while. The rain was coming down hard now against the roof, the way it does when the worst of it finally arrives after threatening all night. And there was something in the sound of it with the lamp going and the coffee in my hands, and her across the table that settled something in me I hadn't known was unsettled. She said, "You do that alone too much." I said, "There's Enrique." She said, "I mean you go out into things alone before you'd ask for help." I thought about that. I said, "It's my land." She said, "Yes, and a man can do a lot alone on his own land. And a man can also go down in a draw in the dark in the rain and not come back, and there'd be nobody who knew where to look." I looked at her. There was nothing dramatic in her face, nothing performed, just the same level gray eyes saying what they were saying, which was, "I would have looked for you. I would have needed to know where to look." I said, "I'll tell you next time." She said, "Thank you." She wrapped her hands around her cup. Rain on the roof, lamp burning, neither of us in a hurry to move. She said, "I don't regret it, in case you wondered." I said, "Marrying me." She said, "Coming out here, what I found instead of what I came for." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Dallin would have been good to you." She said, "I believe that. I also know that a man who writes well isn't always the same as a man who's good when things go hard." "And you've been good when things go hard." She looked at her coffee. "That matters more to me." I sat with that. She said, "I'm telling you something." I said, "I know." She said, "I want to make sure you hear it." I said, "I hear it." She looked at me, I looked at her. The rain came down, the lamp went on burning. We'd been married 3 months when she moved her things from the room I'd given her into mine. There was no ceremony to it. One evening her hairbrush was on the chest, and her shawl was on the chair, and that was that. Neither of us marked it as an occasion because neither of us needed to. What I remember most from that summer is the ordinary of it. The way she'd be standing at the stove when I came in at noon, and she'd set the plate down without looking up because she'd heard the boots on the step, and she knew the weight of them. The way we'd ride the fence line on Saturdays and she'd spot things I'd ridden past for years. A section of post going gray and soft on the south side. A spot where the wire was straining on the third run, small things, patient-eye things that saved you grief later. The way she laughed, which she didn't do often, but when she did it was real and it happened when you didn't expect it. Something in the middle of an ordinary sentence that caught her, and she'd press her hand to her mouth like she was trying to hold it in, and it came out anyway. I had not expected this, I want to say that plain. I had not expected at 54 years old to have this. I'd been a bachelor long enough that I'd made peace with it, or told myself I had, the way you make peace with a wound that healed wrong. You stop noticing most of the time, and then something moves in a certain direction, and you remember. I don't think I knew it was loneliness until it wasn't there anymore. That's how those things work. You don't see the shape of what was missing until something fills it, and then you look at the outline and think, oh, that's what that was. In September, she got a letter from her sister in Ohio. I came in from the north field, and she was at the table reading it, and there were 2 wet marks on the wood where tears had fallen, though her face was dry by the time I sat down. She didn't try to hide the marks. She said, "My sister had a baby, a girl." I said, "That's good news." She said, "She wants me to come visit." I said, "You should go." She said, "It's a long way." I said, "I know, you should still go." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You'd be all right here." I said, "I ran this place for 30 years before you came." She said, "I know, and I'm not asking you to need me, I'm just—" She stopped. She looked at the letter. She said, "I'd miss it here." I said, "It'll be here when you come back." She looked up. She said, "You'd want me back." It wasn't doubt. It was something else. A woman asking a man to say a thing plainly that he'd been saying in every other way except plainly, and she was right to ask it. Some things want to be said in the words. I said, "Cora, this is your home, I'm your husband. When you come back from Ohio, I will be standing in this yard to meet you, same as I'd expect you to wait for me if I was the one going. That's not a favor, that's what this is." She held my eyes. Something in her face went very still, and then it didn't, and she stood up from the table and came around it and put her arms around my neck the way you hold onto something you were afraid for a moment of losing, pressed her face into the side of my jaw, and I put my hands on her back and held her and felt her breathe. She said against my collar, "All right, Harlan." That was all she said. But the way she said my name, not Mr. Cade, which she'd been calling me less and less, just Harlan, plain and close, I felt it somewhere I didn't have a word for. She went to Ohio in October, and she came back in November, and I was standing in the yard. I'm going to tell you one more thing, then I'm done. The winter that year was hard. January went down bitter and stayed there, the kind of cold that makes the wood in the walls talk at night, contracting little cracks and pops in the dark. We'd wake to it sometimes and lie still listening, each of us knowing the other was awake without saying so. One of those nights, she said, "Tell me about Dahlin." I hadn't talked about him. I'd answered her questions when she asked them in those first weeks, but I hadn't talked about him the way I could have, the way she'd been asking me to without using that word. So I told her. Not the telegram, not the last part, but the 22 years of it, the early drives and the cold camps, and the time he'd talked me out of a decision that would have cost me the whole North pasture if I'd gone through with it, and the time I'd sat with him through a fever, and he'd been delirious and called me by his brother's name for 2 days, and I'd answered to it because it didn't cost me anything. I told her about the night he'd filed his homestead, and we'd sat on the ridge in the dark and watched the stars, and he'd said, "Harlan, this is the one. This is the place I'm going to be buried." And how he'd meant it as a good thing, as permanence, as the end of moving, not as a prediction. She listened in the dark without a word. When I finished, she said, "He sounds like someone who made things feel all right." I said that's exactly what he was. She was quiet, then she took my hand under the blanket and held it. She held it for a long time. The walls ticked in the cold. Somewhere outside the cottonwoods were creaking. I lay there in the dark with her hand in mine and thought about how a man doesn't plan for this. Doesn't see it coming, doesn't set out to earn it. You do your work, you keep your word. You stand for what's right when standing is hard and costs you something. And then, if you're lucky, not because you deserved it, exactly, not in a way you can point to and say that's the trade, something comes to you that you didn't know you needed. I thought about Dahlin. I thought about the ridge and the stars, and him saying this is the place. I turned my hand and held hers back. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the cold sat down on the land, and the lamp in the kitchen had long since burned out, and it was just the dark and the sound of the house and her hand in mine. "That's all I've got for you. That's the whole of it. That's how it went."